begin. Morning. Today we're learning Gemara Meseches Shabbos. We are on Gimel Amud Beis. That would be 3b and 4a. We're going to still be talking about a little bit about carrying, but today we're going to finally see a slight variation in the subject matter. And we're going to get up to a juicy discussion about, is there ever a license to sin? Are there scenarios where the Torah would say, go ahead, do an Aveira? Does that exist? And so stay tuned. There's a small chance, there's a small chance that we'll end a few minutes early because we're going to stop at the end of the next section we'll wait for Sunday. But that is that. Point out, today is the 6th of November, the 19th, right? The 19th of Cheshvan. And we're learning Gemara, and it's a Friday, Erev Shabbos. And for those that are listening to the future, they're forecasting maybe a storm or a little rain, tropical storm. I don't know what's the name of the storm.
They ran out of names.
What is it?
Ada.
Ada. So they're teaching us the Greek alphabet. I don't remember ever getting this far into past the ABCs. But anyways, no, with Hashem's help, it will not be anything major. If anyone needs assistance or you know someone needs assistance, let us know. But with Hashem's help, this will be a small blip on the radar. And Reb Noyach, welcome to town and welcome to
Thank you.
Maybe your first storm. Alrighty, let's begin. So as you may recall, we're talking about the laws of Shabbos. That's what Tractate Shabbos is going to be about. Our opening discussion, notwithstanding the complexity of it, was about carrying an item from one domain to another domain. And we've already discussed many details of this carrying process. You got to pick it up, you got to move it, you got to put it down into another jurisdiction. One's hand isn't automatically counted as the same domain as the place your body is located, right? Proof is that if a person stretches out their hand with an item into a Rishus HaYachid and you take it from their hand, you have not been considered to have removed something from one domain to another. So the hand is not automatically considered an extension of the domain wherein one's body is located. Again, we discussed it yesterday, but I just want to recap. So again, if I'm standing in my house, or if I'm standing in the shul, and I stretch my hand outside of the shul holding an item, and Reb Allen was somehow here from Montreal, and he took that item out of my hand and placed it down, you would not have been considered removing an item from a private domain, the shul, which is considered a private domain halachically, and placing it into a public domain. The reason being because my hand, although it's attached to a body that's in the shul, is not considered literally in the shul. Conversely, the same would apply to the outside. So the Gemara yesterday asked, so maybe the hand has is like a separate domain, which we introduced the idea of a Carmelite, which is a domain that's rabbinic in nature, but one who was prohibited from carrying from it to another zone. And essentially the question was, are we going to punish the individual who stretched out their hand in the beginning steps of depositing an item from one domain to another to need to stand there till the end of Shabbos? And so yesterday we brought two braitot, one that says that the person does leave their hand out, the other one says that you don't, and we thought maybe that was proof that your hand, according to one opinion, becomes a carmelis, and the Gemara then rejects that answer and gave another alternative interpretation, and that's where we're up to. But don't worry, we're going to move through this fairly quickly, and then we'll move on to our next discussion. Just find the right place in the internet.
You made one big mistake there.
I did. What's the mistake?
If you would stick your hand out of the window with something in your hand, I wouldn't be standing in the rain waiting to grab it.
Well, first of all, I was standing in a door. Second of all, the rain is not raining anymore. But the point is well made. All right. Let's just recap real fast. Toshima, let's try to bring a proof to find out if the rabbis made one's hand like a Carmelist. Your hand was full of fruits, and we mentioned yesterday why fruits, because probably on Shabbos you're trying to move food items for the Shabbos meal. Toni chad aser, there's one braita that says that is not from aser lachzira. You need to stand like that the whole time. You cannot bring your hand back. Toni idach mutar lachzira. The other opinion says that you are allowed to withdraw your hand. My lava kamifligi, can't we say that the crux of the debate, of the distinction between these two teachings are not a dispute, it is a dispute around the subject of, has your hand been turned into a separate domain? Marsav our Carmelist Damya, the one opinion who says that you cannot retract your hand, believes that your hand has now become a second jurisdiction domain, and if the item is in your hand, in a Carmelist, you are not allowed to withdraw it back into your private domain. Or conversely, if you were standing outside and you move your hand inside, you could not withdraw your hand into the public domain. Mar Savar Lafka Carmelist, and the other one says, no, your hand, I don't know what it is, but it's not a Carmelist, and therefore your hand can be withdrawn and it would not be considered carrying an item from one domain to another, which again on Shabbos is a big issue. The Gemara says, we do not have conclusive proof from these two braitot that the issue at hand is your hand a Carmelist or not? Because maybe you would read it as the Kuli Alma Carmelist Damya. Maybe both opinions. There is a consensus, perhaps, that your hand becomes like a separate jurisdiction. Well, like Kashya, and why are there two different texts, two different braitot with two different opinions? The distinction is which height your hand is in. Kan lemata mi'asara, when your hand is close to the ground within 10 tefachim, then your hand is really in the airspace of Rosh Hashanah. And so the rabbis, to penalize you, said, okay, although your hand is not a Rosh Hashanah, we're going to call it a Carmelist, a rabbinically prohibited space, and we're not going to allow you to withdraw your hand. But when your hands are higher than 10, then your hand is essentially not in a public domain, and therefore you can withdraw your hand because if you haven't brought the item even close to the public domain because it's in the airspace. Let's take a look at Rashi, and then I'll ask you to help me make sure that you understand what we've read. Lamata miyud, under 10 tvachim, reshus harabim hu. It is the airspace of a public domain. The rabbis are now going to punish the person who's playing this game of stretching his hand out, or maybe he's not playing the game. Maybe he was hoping to actually move it, and then someone stopped him, or he stopped. V'shavya Carmelis, Deloy lehedara. So the rabbi said, you know what? You're making trouble. We're going to now consider your hand in the public domain as a Carmelist, and now you need to keep it there all Shabbos. L'mayla miyod, avir makom p'turhu. It is in the airspace that is exempt and not considered a domain where you're not allowed to bring this item, as we're going to read at length later on when we discuss the different jurisdictions of Shabbos. The teaching is as follows: Hazoyrek Dalet Amos Bakoisel Amaylam Yutfachim. If you throw something when you're above 10 tefachim on a wall, Kizoyrek Ba'avir Potter. It's as if you've thrown it in a domain where there's no issue of carrying. So long story short, maybe above 10 tefachim in the air, we're not going to penalize you. Which if that is the case, and again, we're still in the middle of a thought process, so don't take this as a psak halacha, but if that was the case, well then, you would be allowed, essentially, to stick your hand out the window with something in it for whatever reason, and then bring it back inside, because you're not moving it into a public domain, you're moving into a makom p'tur. And certainly that would be the case outside of our windows of our apartments, that perhaps that would be permitted. Again, right now we're not making a halachic case, we're simply understanding what the Gemara is saying. Any questions or comments? I know this is kind of technical before we move on. Yes, go ahead.
If you throw it in the air, what if you open your door and you are 6 feet tall and you have an apple and you want to throw the apple 10 feet to your athletic friend next door or your child? How does that work out?
This is a very good question. This is going to be directly discussed in the Gemara later on, so I don't want to incorrectly give you my periphery understanding. We'll explore it together.
But please remember that I said an apple, not a basketball, a baseball.
I was actually going to ask you if you're referring to a fruit or a smartphone. You know, hold on. If this share would have been happening 10 years ago, you would have not have said an apple, you would have said a BlackBerry, and we'd have the same question. Right? No, Reb Noach, go ahead.
Just for my understanding,
yes.
What does hand breath mean?
Very good. A hand breath literally means, in Hebrew, the word hand breath is a tefach, and I'm glad you asked the question. It is a measurement of space, the equivalent of a person's fist, and Mark will tell us that it's approximately 3.5 inches.
About 3 inches.
3 to 4 inches, depending on who you ask. And I'm glad you asked that. And if I fail to give any other definitions going forward, please call me out, because we need to make sure that all of our definitions are clear. And so therefore, 10 tvachim is essentially, Mark, what's the math? 10 tvachim is how much?
About 30 inches.
30 inches, so 2 feet and change, 2.5 feet. Very good. So again, we're right now in the midst of an intellectual exercise, examining 2 texts. One that says you can stick your apple out the window and pull it back in. The other that says you cannot. And we thought maybe the crux of the issue was a debate about the status of your hand, and have the rabbis made a decree that prohibits you from bringing your hand back indoors. And we said, no, maybe the issue, maybe everybody believes that your hand could be like a Carmelite, and it really depends, the height, the elevation where you're sticking your hand out. And again, this is where the Gemara gets a reputation of really being able to do intellectual dances. Dr. Hammer forwarded me a very famous but always funny, humorous conversation with a rabbi and someone who wants to learn a Gemara, and he asks him a series of questions. I'm just going to reference it, and you'll know what I'm talking about the guy who comes down the chimney, and I think that was the one, right?
Yes.
One person washed themselves, and so the question is who was dirty in a hole, and basically every time you analyze the case, you can come up with a varying perspective. And so the Gemara is teaching us to examine a question from every angle. And so that's what we're doing right now. We have 2 case studies. We have a single question, and we're going to explore 3 or 4 different ways of analyzing these conflicting texts. And by the way, I've heard from yeshiva students who've gone on to become lawyers, including my brother, that these exercises eventually are very advantageous for people that want to become lawyers. And many times there are certain elements of law school that are much easier for yeshiva students because they've already been trained to some extent to have this kind of analytical view. And so again, we're going to be doing that exercise here as well. A third method of analyzing the 2 conflicting texts as it pertains to the question of what one's hand is considered in regards to carrying on Shabbos. Maybe both case studies are talking about where the person was carrying the item lower than 10 hand breadths, lower than 30 inches, and one's hand is not considered a third domain. And the conflict is not challenging because your hand is not considered a separate domain. It would be as if your hand is in the public domain. And so bringing it back inside would be considered carrying from a public to private domain. So why does one text permit it and one text prohibit it? The text that says you're not allowed to bring your hand back inside is taking the position, or is because you did the act while it was already sundown and it's Shabbos. And so you've essentially committed the potential act of carrying by sticking your hand outside. And so the rabbis are not going to, or so you're not permitted to bring your hand back inside, or you'll be carrying from outdoors to indoors. But if it is still daytime, which means you stuck your hand out the window, it was not yet Shabbos. And so when you draw your hand back inside, you will not be committing a full act of carrying. Why? Because carrying has two components, picking up and putting down. And because the picking up happened in a permissible time before Shabbos, so putting it down is going to be permissible because you have not done a full Shabbos desecration. So the rabbis only made a knas if you were entirely flaunting Shabbos by stretching your hand out once it is already nightfall. Rashi is explaining what we just read. You stuck out your hand with your apple outside, and then when night fell and it's Shabbos, you pulled your hand back inside, or you want to. We allow you to withdraw your hand back to where your body is back indoors. But if you started playing this game, stretching your hand out when it is dark, you stuck your hand out the door with your apple or blackberry when it was already night. Kansua, the rabbis penalized you, or it could be daytime, on Shabbos. But not literally that your hand has an absolute status of a separate domain, rather knasa ba'alma. So let me explain something else, and then we're going to move on because I could understand if you're feeling a little overwhelmed and confused. In Jewish law, there are two possibilities. Something could have a real status of something, or the rabbis could penalize you as if that is the status. And I'm trying to find better words to explain this. So the question is your hand literally considered another kind of space? You have your public domain, private domain, and then you have your hand. Is it literally a separate domain? Or did the rabbis simply or do they simply punish you as if your hand was a separate space? So the question here is your hand literally a separate space, or is it only as if? So the earlier reading said it's literally a separate domain. This reading says no. In a sense, your hand is an extension of your body. So whatever your body is, that's where your hand is. But the rabbis didn't like this game you're playing, stretching your hand out, where you may have come to drop it and then you would be desecrating Shabbos. So they're going to penalize you. So long story short, let me just recap one more time. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to throw something out of your house or play something that was indoors to outdoors. That's not allowed, right? But if you started the act before Shabbos, then you will never have biblically desecrated Shabbos, so the rabbis are not nervous. But if on Shabbos, once Shabbos starts, you take your apple and you stretch your hand and put it out the window, if you were to drop that apple, you would be desecrating Shabbos. If you didn't drop the apple, you're only teasing or only, starting that process of potentially desecrating Shabbos. And so what we just explained is that if you were not ever technically in breach of Shabbos, the rabbis go easy on you, and they say you can bring your hand back inside. But if you're teasing, if you're flaunting the law, if on Shabbos you're an inch away from breaking Shabbos, the rabbis say, okay, you're making trouble. You got to now keep your hand there till Shabbos ends. That was what we just read. The Gemara says, I don't understand. And this is, again, another instance where the Gemara tries to flip everything on its head. But again, this is not just for an intellectual game. This is to really try to analyze and have real clarity on the issue. The Gemara says, your logic could be flawed. Ibcha mistabra, the opposite would actually make sense. When would the rabbi say, keep your hand where it is? When you will, even if you drop the item, you will not be in an absolute desecration of Shabbos. But if you did it on Shabbos, you stretch your hand out, were you to drop the item, you will have desecrated Shabbos. The rabbis should not want a person to be in jeopardy of desecrating Shabbos. And let me ask you a question. If you hold an apple in your hand and you stretch it out the window, how long could you keep your hand there before dropping it? Anybody? Unmute yourself and let me know how long you think you could hold an apple out the window without dropping it. Help me out, someone. Come on. How long?
Probably not all that long.
Okay, how long?
Holding.
I don't know, maybe after 15 minutes, you'd probably drop it.
Okay, Mark says 15 minutes. The doctor's actually practicing. He's holding his apple.
I'm holding it.
And right now, Dr. Hammer, right now it seems very easy, right?
I mean, you got it on the temperature, so that's
But as a Kohen, I could tell you, you hold up your hand for duchening. Alan, right? You start, it's no big deal. I assure you, within the halfway through Birchas Kainim, all you want to do is put your hand down. And I assure you that holding your apple,
Holding your hand like this, not up like this, though. That's the difference.
I suspect you'll still be.
I figured you could make it for 15 if you really, with difficulty.
Okay, so in other words, what are we saying? That if the rabbis tell you that in order to discourage such behavior, should you actually do it, you'd have to remain holding it the entire time. What's possible to happen? What's likely to happen?
You'll drop it.
You'll drop it.
And then you
What
do the full bar.
happens? What happens if you pick up, this is left over from the ceiling. What happens if I pick this up, I stretch my hand out the door, out the window, and you tell me I gotta now stand here for 2 hours, 3 hours, 5 hours, 10 hours? The odds are I'm not a superhuman, I'll drop it. If I drop it, I will have desecrated the Shabbos. Surely the rabbis don't want to create an environment where you might come to desecrate Shabbos. So why would you punish somebody with a penalty that would lead them to desecrate Shabbos? And so that's what the Gemara just said. It would make sense that if I stuck my hand out before Shabbos, even if I drop it, I will not be in a absolute breach of Shabbos. I will be doing a rabbinic, not advised breach of Shabbos, but not an absolute biblical desecration. That's what the Gemara just said. Okay. Let me just, all right, Doctor, you have a question or a comment? Go ahead.
Just as a sidelight, as a comical sidelight. Now I understand why you as a Kohen and Alan, during Duchening, you keep on complaining, ay.
There you go.
But don't think it's so easy to wash hands and feet of strangers. It's not easy.
We sympathize for our Levi friends too. All right. So the Gemara. I'm gonna try to. I'm gonna keep on recapping. I just want to make sure we're crystal clear. We have two texts. One text says that you can stretch your hand out and bring it back inside. And the other text said if you stuck your hand out, keep it there. And in our latest iteration, what we explained is, if you stretched out your hand before Shabbos, where your crime is not so severe, the rabbis have allowed you to withdraw your hand. But if you did it on Shabbos, where you're essentially 50% on the way to desecrating Shabbos, the rabbis have now penalized you, which again, the point of a penalty is not because you want to punish the guy, it's to disincentivize others doing it. The rabbis created a knas, a penalty that says if you are not outside of an Eruv, obviously, and you intentionally take your apple and stick it out the door, you got to stay there because you were 50% towards desecrating Shabbos, and that's a highly undesirable thing for a Jew to do, certainly from the halachic perspective, and therefore you're being punished. The Gemara challenged that notion by saying, hey, come on 1 second. But by doing that, you're going to cause the person to be more likely to desecrate Shabbos. Surely the rabbis should let him bring his hand back inside, even though it's not great, to avoid an absolute desecration of the Shabbos. But the Gemara does not give that explanation. This is the proposed question, but this is not the explanation. So again, we gave a proposed explanation, and we gave a question. The question, this proposal of saying that you should be able to stretch your hand out and bring it back lest you come to desecrate Shabbos is not accepted. And this is where it gets confusing, but it also gets interesting. From the fact that the rabbis did not explain that a person is allowed to withdraw their hand in a scenario where the alternative would be the potential of breaching Shabbos, we should now gain clarity to another question. And although this is connected, it is also a separate discussion, and that's why I want you to take a deep breath now. And even if what was said until now is confusing, let's take a look at this new case. It's the first time we're going to pivot away from carrying for a moment. There is a question once asked. The boy Rabibi bar Abaya, Rabibi son of Abaya asked, Hidbik pas betano. So let me explain this. In ancient times, I don't know if the word is ancient, in biblical and Talmudic and Mishnaic times, we did not have ovens with racks the way we do. We did not even have ovens that are akin to our matzah ovens. As you know, the matzah ovens are typically, or the pizza ovens, there's a stone floor, and we place the bread on the stone floor, and maybe next to it or behind it, or if it's electric underneath it and above it, there is heat. That is something like what we currently use to bake, I think. Well, I know that's what we do for matzah. And I think when I've seen challah made in my house as well, we place it on a rack, maybe you put on a pan. That's how we bake bread. But once upon a time, the technology was different. And I have to tell you, I was looking online. I wanted to find a picture. I wanted to show, actually, hang on one second. Let me see if I can find. I saw a picture, but I wasn't able to find where I saw it. What they used to do is they'd have a big dome-shaped oven, and the fire was in the middle, and they would attach the dough to the wall of the oven. That's how they used to bake bread. And I think, I don't know, has anyone been to the Bedouin camps? When you're in Israel, you know, in the Negev, they take you. So they also create bread, but I don't think they do it exactly the same way, but they also kind of smack the dough that turns into a lapa of sort over the stone, right? Or over the... So I don't think it was precisely the same technology, but imagine the same idea where you're lobbing a hunk of dough onto the side of a hot oven. And then when you're ready to remove your bread, there was an art form of removing the bread in a way that didn't cause the bread to fall apart or to be damaged. And that's why you needed a professional guy to help you out. Parenthetically, in Mishnaic and Talmudic times, people didn't typically own their own ovens, bread ovens. There was a single communal oven where people would bake their bread, and every person in town was entitled to access to the communal oven. Now, what may sound surprising to you is, if I recall correctly, even not so long ago in the shtetl, in the pre-war era, there were shtetls and communities that had certain common what's it called? Common communal utilities, such as maybe a communal oven.
Like a courtyard, I guess.
But this is more than a communal courtyard. The whole shtetl might have one, or maybe the courtyard would have one oven, and everyone would have to take turns. There was also this we know, there wasn't like, not every person, not even every farmer had their own mill.
Well,
Bring your flour to the miller.
There were definitely communal kitchens.
And there were communal kitchens, as well as communal facilities and communal bathhouses.
And water too. You see in Italy now, in all the old towns, they have water in the middle of the courtyard.
So the point is, good to have you on. See, for whatever reason, I don't see everybody. They only show me some of the guys, so it's hard to know. Let's see if I can, if I expand it, I can't see my page. All right, let's pull it down.
That's
You don't have to
typical.
see me. Don't give up the page to look at me. Don't worry.
Yeah, he's not showing his face anyway.
All right, let's figure this out. So basically, yeah, you had a common utility, a common amenity. And so, now maybe you'll have a common pool in your building. Well, in those days, you had a common oven, maybe a common restroom, maybe a common bathhouse, which is why it was a yontif when you took a bath in those days. And so you also had an oven. But what's relevant here is not the communal aspect of it. What's relevant is that was the way they would break bread. They'd lob it onto the side of the oven, and then it would be pulled off in a very particular manner. Now, as you may know, baking on Shabbos is prohibited. The question is, when are you considered to have baked bread? When have you transgressed? When have you, I'm trying to find a better word because it sounds very like judgmental. Here we're just talking about the technical definition. When has one done the act of baking according to the laws of Shabbos? Not the moment you attach it to the oven, but the moment that you attach it to the oven and the bread becomes ready. So what is to happen if you didn't know that it was Shabbos, or you forgot that it was Shabbos, and you placed the dough in the oven to begin cooking it? Well, now you have done an act that is prohibited on Shabbos. And in temple times, and to this day, there are severe repercussions for being in breach of Shabbos, spiritual repercussions. You may have to bring an offering, and by the way, offerings weren't cheap. If one was warned, there would even be, God forbid, capital punishment under rare circumstances. So what do you do if you made a mistake and you placed your dough on the oven? So technically what you could do is abort mid-process. Abort the mission and pull the dough out of the oven, and now the dough is not baked, and you have not baked, and therefore you could still be in compliance with Shabbos. So what's the issue? Of course you should take the bread off. Well, there is an issue, because there is another act that is prohibited on Shabbos, though not to the same extent, and that is the act or the art of removing bread from the oven. You're not allowed to attach bread, you're not allowed to remove bread from it. So are you allowed to do a lesser desecration of Shabbos by moving the bread from the oven, and the expense to avoid a more severe breach of Shabbos, but you're committing another crime? And so and this opens a very big can of worms. So the scenario here is very limited. It's a question of, can you remove the dough from the walls of your oven so that it's not baked, so that you will not be in breach of Shabbos in a more severe manner? And the broader question is, can a person do a lesser Avera to escape a greater Avera? The next question, which becomes the question of our Gemara, so I'm sharing it with you now in introduction to this question, is what if it's not you that attached the dough to the oven? What if it's your friend? Your friend broke Shabbos by putting bread in the oven. Can you help him avoid the sin by aborting his bread breaking? So are you allowed to do a lesser sin to help your friend avoid a greater sin? So before we go further, and again, this is a lengthy discussion, I'd like to get a poll. What are your feelings? Question number one. Can you yourself do a minor sin to avoid a greater sin? What do you think? I'd love to hear your voice. Feel free to unmute yourself and let me know. Can you do a minor sin to avoid a greater sin yourself? Anybody? I mean, again, we'll learn it. It's a really good question. It's a question the Gemara has. So although the Gemara eventually gives the answer, if the Gemara could have this conundrum, we don't have to feel bad having it as well. What is your sense?
Yes.
So the friend made the mistake.
No, start with you. You did something by mistake. You didn't have it, or maybe on purpose, and then you regretted it. And the only way to escape that greater sin, to abort it, is to do another sin. So, for example, like the bread, you popped something in the oven and you want to pull it out so that you can avoid roofing. Dr. Hammer, what do you think?
I think you can.
You can.
There's no greater or lesser sin.
I'm sorry, Dr. Pasternak?
There's no greater or lesser sin.
Oh, so the doctor's saying a different opinion, and I like what you're saying. How could you say that you'd be allowed to do a lesser sin? Who decides the degrees of severity of sin? A sin is a sin. And although certain sins seem worse than others, the doctor's making the case that don't compound or don't magnify the degree of your first mistake by now going and doing another one. That is a very interesting point. Thank you, Dr. Pasternak, for sharing that. Anyone else?
There's another scenario that I could think of is during Shabbos.
Hold on, but let's try to stay focused on this scenario, if you don't mind. I want to get a little consensus. Alan, what do you think?
This is a scenario.
Oh, okay.
That it's Shabbos, and by mistake, it just happens. You turn on the light switch.
Okay.
So that was a mistake, but now you're committing a sin by turning it off.
Okay, interesting question. I don't think it's exactly the same thing, because here you're not fixing the first mistake, you're just doing another mistake. And again, I'm trying. This is a new exercise for me, because although I've learned this Masechta, I haven't had the thrill of learning with all of you, and I hope you'll stay along for the ride. So I'm trying to find the right words to refer neutrally to melacha, to desecration of Shabbos. And so,
I mean,
help me find the right word, but I don't want to use the word sin or desecration. I would say to commit a melacha, or it's a work in progress. I'll let you know when I come up with the really precise and neutral term to describe what we're trying to define over here. Noah, you had something to say over here?
Well, I was always told a sin is a sin, but I guess in order to avoid a bigger sin, you could, do a minor sin. But
So we have a vote that says do a minor sin to avoid a greater sin. I'm glad you shared that. Last, one more person. Someone want to? Michael, Dr. Elise, any thoughts? Greater sin to a minor sin to avoid a greater sin or not? You're muted. I can't hear you. But I see your thoughtfulness. I want to.
A sin is a sin.
Oh.
I mean, it's.
So our doctor seemed to be in an alignment. Dr. Lisa and Dr. Pasternak are agreeing. A sin is a sin, and
I mean, I don't think you can do a quick fix by doing another sin. It's you're doubling the sin, I think.
Oh, okay, very good. I'm glad you shared that. So now I just want to bring to your attention that this is actually a very, very complex issue, and all of your points are valid because it's really not as straightforward as I painted it. It's small sin, big sin. As Dr. Pasternak said, what's a small sin? Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. The same thing could also happen on Yom Kippur. I mean, inadvertently you're going to open the light in the bathroom and then you're going to try to fix it by closing it.
Right.
But you're sinning.
Right. And I'll tell you, I just want to add something else. Sometimes we have an instinct when we do something that we realize we didn't want to do. Sometimes there's almost an instinct. You almost like flip it and flip it down. So obviously that might be part of the inadvertent, but you're right. And just like Alan said, to flip a switch up and down, that doesn't sound like we're remedying that. We're not eliminating the act. So let me just first start back up and say like this. Bread, the example of bread is unique in that in the eyes of Jewish law, you have not baked until the bread is baked, which means that usually the moment an act is done, it's too late to retract. You pull the trigger, you can't withdraw the bullet. And so most of the acts of Shabbos are like that, where the moment you pull the trigger or you flip the switch, you can't unflip the switch. The switch could go down, but you can't undo the act of flipping the switch up. Hypothetically, if flipping the switch would create a process that would take a minute, well, then maybe you could abort mission. But that's not how it works. So bread is a unique case. There's another thing that's unique, and the Gemara is going to actually discuss this. So let's see the Gemara first. So I think what we can all agree is this is a heavy question, and it's a deep theological question. And along the next few lines, we're going to discover a little bit about what might be considered a varying severity. What does it mean that certain acts or sins have varying severity? And so let's take a look. And again, this discussion starts here, but it doesn't end here. I'll just go right to it right now. Suppose the question is asked, if a person, a Jew, a child, an adult, but probably someone that's in your household, and maybe you have a custody and responsibility for, is going to convert out of their faith. You know that your child is now going to, to the church, to the monastery, to be baptized and to convert to Christianity. This is a very severe thing in the eyes of Judaism, right? Are you allowed to desecrate Shabbos to save that person's soul? Can you jump into a car and drive and appeal to them? What if they're kidnapped? Can you desecrate Shabbos to save them? And so that is another spin-off of this discussion. And it's complicated. The long story is that the Code of Jewish Law says, and maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but I don't want to leave you in suspense. The Code of Jewish Law says that you are allowed to desecrate Shabbos to save a person's spiritually, just like you're allowed to desecrate Shabbos to save a person's life. So if someone is being kidnapped or in harm's way or needs medical attention, to all of our doctors on this group, you are absolutely 100% permitted to desecrate Shabbos to save human life. Well, the Code of Jewish Law says you are similarly permitted to get into your car, If you have somebody that you think is on the way to be lost forever to their Judaism, to their people, you can jump into the car, drive after them and appeal to them or offer them a ride home or a way out. It gets more complicated if the person is not being kidnapped or taken unwittingly. What if the person wants to run away? And that happens too. You know, we have many stories. You read many biographies of great people that were born Jewish in the but in order to be accepted to university, they needed to convert. So tragically, in Eastern Europe and certainly in the West, there were many Jews in the 1800s who converted not out of spite or dislike of their faith, but they needed to be accepted into university or they were going to marry out. And so that's a question. What about if you could stop intermarriage? Can you desecrate Shabbos? That's another question. There are many that say that you could, if you encourage somebody to marry Jewish. And it all boils down to a similar issue. Can you do a sin to help someone escape either a greater sin or a total loss? By the way, there is certainly an opinion, and the Chabad opinion is, for the most part, that you, and not only Chabad, this is brought in the Code of Jewish Law, and the Mishnah Berurah gets a little more nuanced if the person wants or not. You are allowed to desecrate Shabbos to save a person's spirituality, and that happens to be one of the reasons, or one of the, I don't use the word loophole, but that is one of the reasons why certain poskim permit inviting a guest to join you on Shabbos, even if they might be desecrating Shabbos to get there, which seemingly, how could you allow someone to desecrate Shabbos? Well, if the person doesn't know about their Judaism and they don't know about their Shabbos, and they don't come to embrace Yiddishkeit, they'll never have a chance to observe Shabbos. The question is, can you allow them to come join you on Shabbos if it means they're going to desecrate Shabbos? If there's a chance that eventually their Jewish connection will be upgraded, it's a big question, and certainly the case has merit. But let's go back to our discussion. What can you do? What do you do with the bread in the oven? So the Gemara says, we have a question. Hidvik paspatanor, you slap that piece of dough onto the wall of the oven to turn into bread. Hitiru leider daisa, have the rabbis permitted you to pull it off the oven before the bread is baked and before you will be entirely in breach of desecrating Shabbos to the point where that individual would be warranted to bring a chatos offering, a sin offering for the crime, for the avera of desecrating Shabbos. Or have the rabbis not permitted such an act? Let's see Rashi. If you put it in the oven by mistake, Shabbos, maybe you didn't remember that it was Shabbos, and this could happen. You ever woke up out of a deep sleep and you didn't know what day it was?
Every day.
So you hear, but all of a sudden the guy forgot it's Shabbos. He pops a piece of bread in the oven. We're talking about or dough in the oven, I should say. And then he remembers the Shabbos. Before the bread is baked, the Kaimalon, the Gemara later on says, "Ridias apas shavusu." The Gemara later says that removing the bread from the oven is a rabbinic prohibition. It's not exactly considered a melacha, so it is not a biblically prohibited act. It is only rabbinic. Why would they be allowed? Why would you be allowed to remove the bread? Rashi explains, they would allow you to do a rabbinic prohibition, because it's only rabbinic. The yerdena kaidem shetoifa, so you take it down before it's baked. Because if you would allow it to bake, yischai mishum oife, a person would be in breach of one of the core prohibitions of Shabbos, which is baking. Shu'av melacha. This is one of the 39 classifications of prohibited labor or work on Shabbos. Well, you see him in a tan, or maybe the rabbis say, you know what? Two wrongs don't make a right. And so I think we have some answers and some confirmation or affirmation of some of the ideas expressed previously. So Dr. Pasternak asked a wonderful question. If there are two sins in the Torah, are we going to allow you to do one at the expense of the other, or to undo the other? The two sins. You can't compare, and he's right. But Rashi explains we're not talking about two biblically prohibited acts. There is an act that is prohibited in the Bible, and there's an act that is only rabbinically prohibited. So have the rabbis given license to do a rabbinic less severe act of removing the dough to avoid a biblical, more severe act of the desecrating of Shabbos. And to Abaye, the question is not obvious. It's a conundrum. He doesn't know the answer. Doctor, go ahead, because then we're going to get complicated again for a moment.
I don't know if you want to get into this, but a question is a scenario. So your wife or whoever, you decide to bake challah. So you're baking challah, and lech benching is at 5:15, right? So my question is about the extra 18 minutes or whatever number there, and so you know that, okay, oh my God, I didn't realize it's so early this week, and
this is the Shabbos for such a thing to happen.
What? It's a good Shabbos, yeah, good example.
But no, we're now an hour earlier.
So right, so now I know I need another 15 minutes before this challah is baked.
Right.
And now it's lich benching. It's 5:15 now, and my wife didn't light candles yet, and now we realize that whatever. What's the story with the 18 minutes? Not only for that, but for other things also.
So don't get frustrated at me. This is another one of the subjects that we're going to tear into in depth and at length.
Okay.
And so this too, I'm going to push off, not to discuss outside of the Gemara, but to discuss it, God willing, in the future within the framework of the Gemara's discussion. But maybe we should keep a list, a tally, so that we can go back and say, okay, now we're responding to issue number 3 or 4. So again,
I'll put it on my list is already.
Okay, we have 47 of brachas. Some have been responded to. But I just want to add one more thing. The doctor asked an interesting question about bread and Shabbos and 18 minutes. So you actually asked a lot of questions. Would you be allowed to cook something, put something in the oven before Shabbos if it's going to cook into Shabbos? That we're going to discuss going forward. Can you set a process in motion? Another question, of course, is the specifics of bread, and also do the 18 minutes permit you to do the malacha? And so I'm going to defer for now simply because it's something that we're going to discuss, God willing, at length. So the Gemara has a question. Can you pull the bread down or not? Bibi Bar Abaye never got an answer. He was left with a question. And so the Gemara says, why did we leave with a question? All Bibi Bar Abaye needed to do is recall our previous discussion about if you stick your hand out the window on Shabbos and the rabbis don't permit you to retract your hand, which means the rabbis did not permit you to do something that is rabbinic. Move your hand from that you stretched out on Shabbos back in, even though not letting you do the smaller rabbinic prohibition of putting your hand outside and inside may cause you to break Shabbos in the most severe manner of carrying an item from inside to outside. So from the fact that the rabbis don't permit you to do a lesser evil, if you will, to bring your hand back inside to avoid a greater evil, we should infer that the rabbis do not allow you to take your bread off the oven when it was placed on. So, because we didn't answer that the rabbis are worried about doing a bigger sin, and so they should have let you do a smaller sin, we should infer that you cannot take the dough off the oven. And then the Gemara goes even further. And again, after this line, we're going to be done with this. So, Tifshai to Layetiro. So based on what we said, the rabbis do not allow you to remove your dough. But because Abaye was left with a question, it causes us to question our assumption here about the explanation of the two practices. In short words, and then we're done with this, sometimes you have a question. And the answer seems so obvious that you know the answer is wrong. Have you ever had a question or wondered something and no one knows the answer and you're like, I know the answer, it's so obvious. And then like, no, if the answer was so obvious, everyone would know it. So from the fact that no one knows the answer, my assumption must be wrong. Has anyone ever experienced that? I'm trying to think of a good example. You know, sometimes you have an issue and the fix seems so simple, but no one else can think of it. You say that cannot be the fix, because if that was the fix, everybody would figure out. Help me out. Anyone have an example, or has anyone ever experienced this? Where the answer that you think is the answer is so simple, you figure it can't be the answer. So that's what the Gemara says over here. From the fact that Abaya, Bibi Bar Abaya, didn't refer to the question of stretching out your hand on Shabbos, we should prove that our understanding of the story of sticking your hand is wrong. And the Gemara rejects it. It says, Hale kasha b'tifshay. No, sometimes you have a question and no one else seems to know the answer, but it doesn't mean that your answer is incorrect. So long story short, at this point we've said that you should be allowed, that you should not be allowed to remove your bread from the oven on Shabbos. But we're not going to stay there, because ultimately the Gemara is going to explain that you can do a sin for yourself. Hang on one second. Alternatively, we could say that you do not resolve the issue of what to do. Or maybe we'll say, you know what, we have two contradictory texts in the Brisa, and the answer is not about if the rabbis give a knas, like kasha kam b'shoigeg kam b'mezid. Maybe the answer to if you can withdraw your hand with the apple or not is very simple. Kan b'shoigeg, kan b'mezid. The whole difference is if you did it on purpose or not. If you did it by mistake, the rabbis let you undo it. Mezid like on Surah, but if you intentionally stuck your hand out the window, the rabbis did not let you do it. Alternatively, I'm going to do this fast, and if you don't get it, it's okay. Maybe both scenarios where you stuck your hand out the window, it was a mistake. The only question is, when the rabbis say you're not allowed to do something, if the rabbis punish you for doing something intentionally wrong, do they then extend that punishment or that consequence even when it was done by mistake? Okay, long story short, alternatively, there is no punishment. So again, we have two opinions or two stories about if you stuck your hand out with fruits. One says you can't withdraw, you can't pull your hand back inside. The other says that you cannot. Maybe the difference is very simple. The difference of intentional or by mistake. If you do something by mistake, we're not going to punish you for making a mistake. The rabbis might punish you for doing something intentionally. Or maybe the whole difference is where you stretched your hand outside. If you're going to bring your hand back into the original home that you stretched your hand out, so then you can do so. But what if you stuck your hand outside of one apartment, let's say, and then you walked around and you pulled your hand back inside in another apartment? So then you got your way. And so if you got your way, you played a trick and you were able to get your way, we're not going to let you do it. All right, this ends that discussion. Long story short, two texts about sticking your hand outside with a million different ways of explaining it. And parenthetically, we talked about the bread case, which allows us to discuss our question of if you could do a minor sin to escape a greater sin. So yeah, that's that's an example of the Gemara really doing mental gymnastics to examine and propose many different ways of understanding a single text. And the bottom line of this Gemara is a reminder that sometimes you read something and it seems simple and you think the definition or the interpretation is obvious, but you have to allow the possibility for many different interpretations. And this is the value in general of discussing an issue or a question and getting more than one angle. And this is also why our sages tell us, Shivim Panim Torah. Sometimes a single story account or halacha could have 70 different angles, and they could all be true because everybody experiences the same event from their own vantage point and their own perspective. And that's why we have essentially over here two texts about carrying and many different ways of understanding it. Now, I don't want to end off on that complicated note, so let's just read a few more lines into the easier territory. Gufa. I hope we didn't lose too many people in the process. Gufa, the very same text about the bread and the sinning. Boy, Rabbi Barabai, here was the question. In the class batanor, you smack some bread onto your oven wall to bake it. Have you been permitted? Do the rabbis allow you to pull it down, although you're doing a lesser evil, you're doing a rabbinic prohibition to escape a greater degree? Rav Acha asked the question, hey Chidami, what exactly is the scenario? The question is too broad. Help us fine tune it. Are we talking about where the guy made a mistake? He forgot it was Shabbos? Was like Yitzkarle and he never remembered? Lamani Tiro. So what does it mean he's allowed to take it down? He doesn't know that there's an issue to correct. Right? Sometimes you do something by mistake. If you don't know there's a mistake, you can't correct it. So what is Abai talking about? That a person placed the bread on Shabbos. Did he do it by mistake? Well, then how would he ever know? Ella, lav de ihadar v'itkar. Maybe he did it by mistake and then he remembered, oh, it's Shabbos. He opened his phone because he forgot it's Shabbos and then he saw it was Saturday. Could happen. So in the case where a person started off by mistake and ended off realizing his mistake, mimechayev, would he be culpable to bring an offering in such a scenario? And we're going to bring a text that says that actually it's highly, the scenario in which you bring an offering is highly specific. The offering that one brings for a mistaken sin only applies if he did it from the beginning to the end. And our text here with our question says, we're worried about avoiding having to bring a carbon, an offering. Amazing. Rather, what are we talking about? The guy put the bread in the oven on purpose. But then he felt bad and he wants to undo it. Well, that can't be the scenario either of the question. Because if a person were to intentionally desecrate Shabbos in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, there would be not an offering brought, but he could be culpable for capital punishment for stoning. So the text of the question would need to be rephrased. So what is our case? Amar Rav Shela. What was the bias question? Our whole question is, you made a mistake. And who is looking for a license to do a smaller sin? We're talking about two people. I made the mistake and you want to help me avoid my sin. And so the halacha is, if I'm not mistaken, that if a person, just to give you an answer because we're almost done, if a person put bread in the oven, he himself would be allowed to remove it to escape the sin. And our whole question, the whole issue here is, can a person do a sin to help out his friend? Can a person be told, you know what you should do? Go do a sin. And your friend will be the benefit of your mistake or of your sin, of your desecration of Shabbos. Rather, what are we talking about? Oh, no, I'm sorry. Let's pause right over here. Tomorrow or Sunday, we're going to continue and go more in depth and expand on our question of, can you sin to help your friend? Because there are many other scenarios, many other questions, and we'll hopefully broaden and expand on the parameters of when and when you cannot do something wrong to help your friend avoid something even more wrong. Before we close, anyone want to think of some examples that we might look out for in the future? What's another example of you doing something wrong, but you're helping your friend make a greater mistake? So I'll give you a different scenario that's discussing the, well, you know what, well, I'll hold off till Sunday. There's a lot more to discuss on the subject. So let me just give you a 30-second recap, because today we really did some mental gymnastics. We have one single or two texts that are contradictory, talking about sticking your apple out the window. And we brought a majillion different possible ways of analyzing those two texts. Along the way, we had the opportunity to discuss the possibility of being compelled to do something by the rabbis, even though it may end up being a more severe breach of Shabbos. Namely, if you hold your hand outside, you might drop the item and then you'll be fully in breach of Shabbos. Whereas if you pull your hand inside, you will only have done a rabbinic prohibition And the question is, or the issue is, evidently the rabbis did not care. And if they didn't care, that would be an indication that you cannot do a smaller sin to avoid a greater sin. In the end of today's discussion, we have not yet conclusively made that case. On the contrary, it would appear that one is allowed to do something smaller in that case. But that doesn't mean that you're allowed to flip your switch back down, because when you make a mistake, first of all, mistakes happen, we're humans. But when we flip the switch, we've already done what we've done. Flipping the switch down doesn't undo that, it just does something else. So we need to think of a very specific scenario where you've set a process in motion, but it can still be aborted through another kind of intervention. And that's the question. Can you do an intervention to stop your friend's crime that's already in motion? And obviously, if you can stop them, you should. But what if the only way to stop your friend's sin is to also do something that's not Jewishly sanctioned? That's the question on the table. I want to thank all those that had the endurance and the determination to stick here for the entire hour. Today was certainly another brain stretching day in the Gemara, and I hope you'll continue on with Hashem's help soon. This will be like you'll do this in your sleep. Have a wonderful day, a healthy Shabbos. Don't forget to smile, and with Hashem's help, we should see great blessings for health, happiness, B'surot Tovot for Am Yisrael, the land of Israel, and part of the way we get that is by keeping a big smile on our face, and we pray for health, healing, and happiness. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Don't forget, we changed the clock, and Shabbos now begins and ends an hour earlier than last week. So that's what the doctor was referencing when he talked about a person not realizing that Shabbos is only 18 minutes away. It could happen, and I suspect it's going to happen in many households across the globe, especially. Anyways, that's that. Please feel free to rejoin the link in just a moment, and Rabbi Shalom Ber will be teaching today's Chumash. Good Shabbos.
Shabbos.
Thank you.
Also, hang on.
Good.